So with the sheer amount of content that we have to produce these days, it's really hard to stay original. And we are coming into the time of year now when we start thinking about spring fishing. But I did think that it would be a little bit too obvious to do a spring tactics video, so I'm not going to do that in this video. Oh, hang on, sorry. Who's that? All right, Ed, how's it going, mate? Oh, you wanted me to do a spring tactics video, but it's still February, mate. It's only 4 degrees. I thought we've sort of done that to death anyway. Oh, yeah. I've got to do it, have I? Right. Yeah. Okay. No worries. I'll get on it. See you later. Bye. Well, the boss has spoken, and it turns out we are going to be doing spring tips on this session, but not your everyday standard run-of-the-mill tips that you've heard 1,000 times before. I'm going to give you several little edges and tweaks that you can put into your fishing at this time of year. I'm talking about bait tweaks and spot choices, things like that, things you can do to put the odds in your favour when the carp are still not really moving around very much and they're not very hungry. So I'm going to be doing 48 hours. I'm going to take you through all my tactics for this session, and then I'm going to give you my sort of thought process and thinking behind preparing for spring in the late winter. Now's the time to be doing it. So let's see what happens on this session, and hopefully some of these tips will help you guys have your best spring yet. Well, here we are down at my local club lake, and it doesn't look like much on camera. You know, it's only small, but if you took the islands out, it's probably about 4 acres, but there's 2 big islands in the middle, which kind of cuts down the actual amount of water in the lake, but it makes it an interesting place to fish. And the fishing here have really come on now. I'd say every other fish is a 20-pounder, and there's a good sort of 2 or 3, maybe 4 30s at the right time of year as well. So I'm really hoping that a couple of those will come along on this session and make it worthwhile. So what did I do? I got down here, had a little walk around first, as we should always do, looking for signs of fish, but I didn't really see anything, to be honest with you. The fish aren't particularly active now, and there wasn't a lot to go on, but I have fished here a couple of times before at this time of year, and this end always seems to produce the goods for me. I don't know why, but the carp seem to like getting down here. It's about as far away as you can get from the car park, so that's a good tip on these kind of busy club waters. Try and get away from where a lot of the sort of lazy anglers will go. People tend to sort of get out the car and go for the first swim and kind of set up camp for a few days. I like to kind of get away from the pressure and the sort of noise of the car park, right up the far end where it's a bit quieter. So I got in my swim, and the first thing I did was got my bait prepped. Now I really like the Trakker buckets that have got the little internal section. I think they call it the cuvette or something like that. Don't really know what that word means, but it's a bucket with a bucket in the top, a bit smaller. What that allows me to do is prep my bait in that top bit and keep all my hook baits and things like that underneath. So basically I got some of the cell response pellets, put a little covering of those in the bottom of there, and added some boiling water to it. Now why have I done that? The idea is it softens them up. It allows you to mould them together into a ball, and it can hold all your other sort of bait particles in it, in little sort of balls of ground bait if you like. So you soak them with the hot water. Then I've crumbed in some essential cell boilies, just that sort of fruity, citrusy kind of smell, which is really good for this time of year, I think. And I've also added a little bit of salt as well. Now that is a very, very big edge for this time of year. The carp spawn kind of late spring, you know, sort of May time, June sometimes, depending on the temperature. And for spawning, they really, really need salt. Now, there's not an awful lot of salt in their natural diet. in the lakes and things like that. So if you can put salt into your bait, it can really enhance it and give the carp those kind of minerals that they need at this time of year. So I always put salt in my bait at this time of year. And I've also put a little sprinkling of the mainline cell ground bait as well. It's got lots of little particles, bits of maize in there, bits of hemp and stuff, just to keep those carp grubbing around a little bit longer on your spot. If you just put boilies out this time of year, you know, it's a mouthful, another mouthful, and they might get full fairly quick. You know, they're not really hungry, they're just sort of looking for a little snack really. So lots of kind of finer particles on the bottom, doesn't fill them up, but you can get lots of attraction into it, and it keeps them rooting around and on your spot a little bit longer, giving you a better chance of a pickup. So using my bucket, I've made that mix up with the hot water, get it all stodgy, let the water soak into the pellets, and then you can ball them up into tiny little balls about the size of a Brussels sprout or something like that. And then I put 5 or 6 of those on a spot, a little sprinkling of essential cell over the top as well, just for those little flecks of colour, and something that's going to match my hook bait as well. But also, instead of just using winter bait, I'm now starting to think about spring, so I'm going to incorporate a fish meal into my mix as well, very, very lightly. But I've got some of the mainline ISO fish, and I've just scattered in probably, you know, 20% of that into the mix, along with the rest of the essential cell and everything else. So it just gives them that little flavour signal of the fish meal to hopefully get my lake and my spots prepped for when the fish do want more high protein bait. So if you can get them used to your bait early on in the spring, then when it comes to time when they're actually hungry, they're already used to eating it, and you've got a much better chance of catching them. So once I'd got my bait all prepped up, I then set about getting my rigs all ready. So if you've watched any of my videos before, I stick to the same rigs really. I've got a withy pool rig for my pop-ups, and then I use a bit of a D rig for wafters and bottom baits and things like that. So pop-ups in the spring are not to be ignored. You know, the carp's eyesight is not as good as it is in the warmer months, so a bright pop-up can really catch their eye and get that inquisitive kind of bite. So I've got one on a mainline pineapple juice pop-up, bright yellow, out with that bait mix that I talked about. And then my other 2 rods are out there on little wafter setups. So one of them is an essential cell bottom bait with half a wafter on top of it, and then the other one is just simply a pink essential cell wafter. So I've covered all bases really. I've got bright ones on because really this time of year I don't really do anything else. You know, I'm trying to get that bite where the fish aren't really hungry, they just see something and pick it up. So a little bit of bait on the spots, a few ground bait balls like I said, and then a few boilies as well. Nothing crazy, minimal bait really this time of year, and then a bright hook bait in amongst it. I'm not trying to feed them, I'm just trying to attract them into the area, and then the hook bait is nice and bright and stands out, and hopefully they take it. So all 3 rods are out now. We're coming into the evening. This day's gone really quick. You know, there's still gets dark at sort of 5 o'clock, and we're on about 4:30 now, so not a lot of daylight left. I'm just hoping that everything that I've done is right. You know, you just never know when you start a session. Although I have caught on here before, so I'm hoping that these tactics are going to be successful for me again. So yeah, we're going to see what the night brings, and then tomorrow I'm going to talk you through a little bit more about my thinking for spring fishing. Well, I was just going to do a little bit to camera for you guys, talking about a few more spring tactics and tips, and I was really interrupted by the middle rod and I'm into my first carp of the year, believe it or not. It's been hard going with the cold conditions that we've had, and it is really nice to hear the DB7R bleeping finally after a few blank sessions. It looks like we're into a nice common here, so I just hope I can get it in the net to show you guys. What a result. It's been a really cold night, and there's a bit of a northeasterly blowing this morning, making it even more difficult. But we are away. Although we're talking about spring fishing, as I said, it is still February, so yeah, back end of winter, and finally we got a bend in the rod. Yes. Come. There we go. Absolutely gorgeous. 21 common in February. Absolutely freezing cold. My hands were cold anyway, but this fish isn't helping. But yeah, buzzing with that. Nice and long, pretty lean. I don't think they've been feeding much lately. Not a lot's been caught from this lake, as far as I know. And it just shows you, you know, these tactics do work. You've just got to be patient sometimes. Those rods have been in the water 24 hours. And one's finally gone off in between the coops picking me up, and northeasterly cold winds, we've managed to get off the mark. So yeah, really happy with that. Lovely fish. Get a couple of photos and get it back, and then I'll carry on talking to you a bit about spring and kind of late winter tactics, and thinking about getting prepped for when the weather picks up and the fish start moving and getting on the feed again. So yeah, well happy with that, guys. Let's get it back. So if you think about it, in the spring, carp's main sort of priority, what it needs essentially, is warmth, because they're coming out of winter and the cold-blooded animals, they're trying to sort of warm up, and also food. So firstly, onto the bait, really, the food that you're going to give them. In the winter, I generally use like a carbohydrate type of bait. Carp don't really process proteins very well in the winter, and they need carbohydrates just to give them enough energy to sustain them and keep the weight on. So through the winter, I'll be using something like Cell or Essential Cell to, you know, keep the fish feeding without sort of filling them up too much. But as you come into spring, as I said earlier, you need to start thinking about fish meals, because towards spawning time, they're going to need more protein to get their sort of spawning weight up. So I'm starting to mix in my fish meals with my carbohydrate type baits, and gradually increase the amount of fish meal until I drop the carbohydrate altogether and use solely a protein bait in the warmer months. So generally I'll start kind of February time, which we are now, and add a little bit of the ISA fish in with my Essential Cell that I'm using on this session, and sort of, you know, 20% to 80%, and then kind of gradually wean them off the carbohydrates, if you like, and onto the protein baits. So between sessions, a really, really good edge in the late winter and early spring is to start visiting your lake a little bit more between sessions and just putting bait onto the spots that you're going to be fishing to get those fish to start looking for that food and finding it and get confident in it, so that when you turn up, they're already used to feeding in that area and on your bait, so you've got a much better chance of catching them. So when it comes to spot choices in the spring, Really, for me, it's all about the shallow water. Now, whether that is shallow water that's over deep water, if you know what I mean, so they're up in the layers, or shallow water that's near to a margin, near to an island, or on a plateau out in the lake. If you think, of a level, I'm sort of looking at sort of 4, 5, 6 foot, that kind of range, then anywhere that you can fish at that sort of level is going to be a good spot. So whether you're out in the middle of the pond, up in the layers on the zigs, or whether you're fishing to an island margin or a near margin or something like that, then those are the sort of spots that you want to be looking at in the spring. Another good tip for your spot choices is to look at where the sun is hitting the lake for the longest part of the day. So generally you're going to find that that's going to be the north or the northeastern part of the lake, because the sun rises in the east, it goes all the way around the south side and sets in the west. So the sun's going to be on that sort of northern bank for most of the day, so that is going to be the warmest bit of the lake, the part of the lake where any natural food, any weed is going to start emerging first as well in your lake after the winter. So the carp are going to gravitate towards those areas, to keep warm, but also, back to my point about needing food, they're going to be looking in those areas for the food as well. So if you can keep bait trickling into those areas and then fish those areas when you're on your sessions, really that is the main part of the puzzle done. And then all you really need to worry about is your hook bait choices and your rigs, really. So let's get on to that next. Right, it's been done to death, but it is worth mentioning that in the spring, bright pop-ups really take some beating. Reason being that, the carp, like I say, they're not that hungry, they're not really looking for a lot of food, but they are sort of starting to move around, starting sort of getting inquisitive, and their eyesight is starting to improve as well. So a bright pop-up just kind of to catch their eye in an area that they're visiting regularly can very often make the difference between a blank session and a couple of bites. So I like to use anything really that's bright. So I've caught on every colour available pretty much, but some of my favourites has got to be a pink one and a yellow one, to be honest, in the spring. And then as I move more into the warmer months, I'll like to use a white one, and occasionally I'll use orange as well, but don't know why, it's just not something that I use all that often, but when I have used it, it has worked as well. So it doesn't seem to matter the colours, but for me, particularly in the spring, the pink and the yellow seems to work really well. I'll also use a wafter, a bright one as well, just mixing it up really, just see what works on each session. If you start catching on pop-ups, then I'll put all 3 rods on pop-ups. But, conversely to that, if the wafters are working, then I'll use those. It all depends on your spot really, but I do find that pop-ups really do seem to come into their own in the spring before spawning time, and then after spawning I'll kind of drop them and go back to like a match the hatch over my kind of fish meal bait. When it comes to rigs, I really don't think it matters. It's up to you. Any good rig that is tied well with a sharp hook on it, put in the right place with a decent bait, will catch you a carp. So don't get hung up on rigs, don't worry about it too much. If you're confident in a Ronnie rig, then go ahead and use it. I like to use a Withy pool rig because it's a little bit higher. I think it gives you better hook holds and more hook to land ratio and less mouth damage as well, which is important to me. So, very easy to tie the Withy pool rig, knotless knot, bit of shrink tube, hook ring, swivel and a bead. It can literally take you a minute to tie a few up, and I'm more than confident in it because I've caught my PBs on it and very rarely lose fish. When it comes to a wafter or a bottom bait presentation, I really like a D style rig these days. I used to like a hair rig, like a normal kind of blowback rig, but I did find if you had a lot of nuisance species on your lake that you would get the hair kind of wrapping around as the fish mess about with it. It didn't reset as well as I liked, and occasionally on the cast as well you would get the odd tangle, so you have to use sticks and things like that to sort of stop the tangles. But now I use a D rig, I never ever get tangles, and I feel like if the small fish are pecking at it, or if a carp comes in and sucks you in and spits it out, it will reset itself, it won't tangle, and it makes sure you're fishing 100% of the time. Another bit of advice I can give you in the spring as well is to look at what the bird life is doing on your lake. Quite often the coots and the tufties and things like that will be diving in certain areas. Now there's always a reason for that. whether that be other anglers' baits or natural food that's emerging in the lake, or sometimes weed. You know, they like to go down and feed on bits of Canadian and stuff like that sometimes. But the birds will give you an indication of likely areas that you might find carp. Now, I'm not saying the carp are always going to be with the birds, but quite often they will be in an area where it's a bit warmer, where there's a bit more food and a bit more kind of shelter from the wind and that sort of thing. So watch what the bird life's doing. I know they're annoying, you know, they can feed on your baits, but if you carry a laser pen or a tufty torch or something like that, you can, you know, spook them off your spot without kind of harming them or anything like that, and they can move them off and just give the fish a bit more of a chance to come in and feed. It's a bit of a balancing act between kind of wanting the birds near to you but not wanting them eating your bait, you know. But it is kind of a really good edge in the spring especially, and the sort of end of the winter, when you really don't know where the carp are going to be. Watch what the birds are doing, and if you're going to walk around your lake and try and find the fish, I would look at where the birds are first and see if you can see any carp activity in those areas. Now, one thing that you might not have heard very often about spring fishing, and this is a really good tip as well, is to work out where you think the carp are going to spawn. So what I mean by that is going to be reed beds, it's going to be weed as well, and any sort of soft kind of substrate that the carp can rub against to get rid of their spawn and reproduce. So quite often you might get tree roots growing into the lake and under the water, which will be covered in kind of algae and things like that, but it's nice and soft, so the carp might come in to spawn on those areas. So quite often towards spawning time, towards the end of spring really, you will find that the carp are going to congregate in those areas where they're thinking about spawning, and you can find a lot of carp all together in a small area, giving you a much better chance of catching. Quite often, you know, some lakes you'll find that most of the lake is absolutely devoid of fish, and then you find one weed bed or one kind of reed line, and the carp are all there kind of huddled together, kind of just following each other around a little bit, starting to think about it. And if you can find that sort of an area, it can be a real sort of honeypot of carp, and you can catch multiple fish before they spawn. I'm not advocating fishing for spawning fish, but pre-spawning, when they're all huddled together kind of looking to get jiggy, you can really catch a lot of carp in that sort of situation. And sometimes in the spring I've had crazy catches where you just can't keep a rod in the water because I've found the fish and they're always hungry at that time before spawning, because they know they're going to expend a lot of energy, so they're trying to build up the reserves and all the sort of minerals and kind of nutrients that they need to sustain them through that period and repair any damage that they're going to encounter as well. So that's some sort of basic spring tips that I can give you. And this session, you know, hasn't really been a spring session, it's still winter. But like I say, I am thinking about my spring now. I am starting to walk around the lake a little bit more and introduce a bit of bait, and I am sort of starting to get my hook baits prepped, maybe adding some liquids and things, and you know, getting everything ready. So I've sort of re-spooling my reels, I'm kind of tidying up my tackle box and that sort of thing, so that when it's time for spring fishing, I've got everything ready to go, and I'm going to be a lot more effective and hopefully catch a lot more carp. Right, I've just been absolutely wiped out by the coots. 2 rods done, as you might see down there. This lake is very shallow, and that is an important point to make about spring fishing and venue choice. You know, look for shallower venues. That lower volume of water will warm up a lot quicker than a deep venue will. The sunlight will penetrate it and it'll get those carp moving that bit earlier, and you'll have a much better chance of catching them. Some of the deeper lakes, you know, they don't really warm up till May, but lakes like this, you know, February, March time, it can be game on. Annoying with the bird life, you know, because it's shallow, they can get down to your bait, but like I said, they can help you locate the carp, and you just have to keep on your toes with your laser pen and just keep moving them off. As I've only got 1 rod fishing and it is already 12:30, I need to get going really. I'm not going to bother putting the rods out, so that's going to be the end of the session. I hope these tips have really helped you for your spring fishing and thinking ahead to your campaign, getting your prep work done, getting baiting up, changing from carbohydrates to fish meal baits, using bright ones, all these types of tips that I've talked about, you know, looking for the right areas on the lakes, shallower water, areas where the fish might spawn and weed beds and things like that, margins, this sort of thing. Think about your spring fishing and put some effort into it. Get out, walking around the lakes, baiting up, and hopefully you'll have your best spring yet. If you've liked the video, make sure you leave a like. Any comments or questions, put them down below. I'll try and get back to you for the first couple of weeks or so. Subscribe to the Trakker channel, and I'll see you in the next one.